That was beautiful. Thank you. So the people of Dayton, Tennessee in 1925 just wanted something to believe in. I get that. Who doesn't want something to believe in? And it seems as though people nowadays, one of the things they are discovering that they can believe in is a good origin story. How did it all start? And as a consequence, we have some new popular TV shows. Anybody here watch PBS's Finding Your Roots? Yeah, right? I start to watch. I don't think I'm going to watch very long, and then I get obsessed. And then I go on the app and I look for all the other shows. I mean, diving into someone else's personal family history, and inevitably, at some point in the show, I start to cry. It's just so powerful for these individuals to learn about family members they had no idea they had, some of the circumstances, how far back they go, how soon they came to the United States. It's very, very powerful stuff. Origin stories, it's really something. So origin stories can explain, they can shape, they can be a lot of fun. I mean, what family, when they all get together, doesn't at some point talk about their origin story? And origin stories can be really, really challenging. And lately, that origin story seems to be challenging as we just talk about the origin story of our nation. There's been a lot of revisioning that's been going on. So in 2019, this book, the 1619 Project, was published. This book reveals truths around our nation's founding and the way that the legacy of slavery did not end with the emancipation, but continues to shape modern American life. So it's their thesis in this book, contributed to by many, many different writers, that not 1776, but 1619 is really the beginning of the United States. And if you mark the beginning of this country with the time that slaves first arrived, you get a very different trajectory than you would if you begin with the traditional 1776. Now, in the summer of 2020, when someone must have briefed then President Trump about the 1619 Project, he went to his Secretary of Education, Betsy Voss, who writes in her memoir of this occurrence. And he said, what can we do to ban the 1619 Project from being taught in public school classrooms? And he was disappointed to learn from Ms. Voss that there was nothing, because the Secretary of Education, the Department of Education, does not set a national curriculum. Undaunted, so this is in the middle of the election during summer of 2020, undaunted, he pulled together a commission that he called the 1776 Commission of conservative historians, revisionists, who wrote like a 45-page history of the nation along with the curriculum and posted it on the White House website 2 days before his administration ended. And he wrote of it, the 1776 Commission will help ensure that every American child learns that they live in the greatest and the most exceptional nation in the history of the world. So you can imagine two very different visions of who we were and where we are going. You can be sure that all of this is going to be brought back up again, because in 2026, the nation is going to observe the 250th anniversary of the United States, and so we're going to be examining, we're going to be reviewing these origin stories. So you've been warned. Next summer, 2025, is also the 100th anniversary of the teaching of another origin story, the origin story of humanity, usually called evolution. In March of 1925, the Tennessee legislature passed the Butler Act, which had been written by John Washington Butler, who was a brand new representative in the House of Tennessee, and he had campaigned on one issue, and that was to make sure that evolution was not taught in the public schools. And this passed unanimously in the House and the Senate of Tennessee, that it is shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, those teaching schools, and all other public schools of the state which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. When the American Civil Liberties Union, under the direction of Roger Baldwin, learned about this new law, they said, that's the law we want to go to court over. They'd been looking for a law to have a court battle over. So they advertised, which is what they often did. They advertised in the state of Tennessee for a defendant who felt that they had broken the law, and they came upon John Scopes in Dayton, Tennessee, who was using, ironically, the state-approved textbook to teach evolution. And he was arrested, put in jail, immediately bailed out. In fact, I think it was the Baltimore Sun that provided the bail money to get him out of jail. If that is where it stopped, that would have been one thing. We may have never even known about the so-called Scopes trial, Tennessee versus John Scopes. Scopes trial, also referred to as the monkey trial. But it quickly ballooned because the prosecution, the state of Tennessee, hired on William Jennings Bryan as their religious expert, who was a Christian fundamentalist, three-time party candidate of the Democratic Party for President of the United States. Under Woodrow Wilson, he became Secretary of State. He was a big guy. And in many ways, his Christianity and his politics were very progressive, except around this issue. And the defense, the ACLU, brought in Clarence Darrow, who was the leading defense attorney around civil rights and labor rights. And all hell broke loose. They initially only had a few reporters coming, but once these two individuals came in, over 200 reporters came to Dayton, Tennessee to cover the story. The courtroom would maybe hold 150, 200 people at max. On many days, there were 3,000 people who came to observe. They had to move outside in order to accommodate for all the people. There were literally monkeys brought to town to go up and down in parades. I mean, it was a zoo. It was chaos in this little teeny town in 1925 of Dayton, Tennessee. With Bryant there and Darrow there, it really wasn't the statue anymore that was being contested. It was individual freedom. It was scientific authority. And at least for Clarence Darrow, it was an opportunity to ridicule Christian fundamentalists, which he did, along with H.L. Mencken from the Baltimore Sun. And Unitarianism's fingerprints were everywhere in this trial and in Dayton, Tennessee. It turns out that Clarence Darrow's father had spent a year at Meadville Theological Seminary when it was in Pennsylvania. It turns out that the Darrow family so admired the Unitarians that one of their sons was christened Ellery William Darrow, after the famous William Ellery Channing, Unitarian minister. Another one was christened Edward Everett, the famous Unitarian senator, minister, chaplain of the Senate. They were well acquainted with Unitarianism, as was Roger Baldwin, the head of the ACLU, had been raised Unitarian. And one of my favorite, I got to meet Roger Baldwin very early in my life, in my ministry in New York City. I was the chaplain to the Unitarian Universalist students at Columbia and Barnard colleges, and we would have these speakers in once a month. One month we had Norman Cousins in, for those of you who can remember Norman Cousins, but we had Roger Baldwin in one night. So the six of us and my wife and I spent an evening with Roger Baldwin. He was absolutely wonderful. He was head of the ACLU, headed up this case, the Scopes trial. I mean, this all makes me sound ancient. Really, I was a young man at the time. Then there was Francis Potter, who was a who saw himself as a religious scholar and a biblical scholar, and he really wanted to testify in the trial, and Darrow really didn't want to put him on the stand because he was afraid he might talk too much and turn too many people off. Can you imagine a Unitarian minister talking too much? He was from the west side of New York, from the West Side Unitarian Church, and he was like everywhere. And when they appealed the case, because they lost in Dayton, so it went to the Tennessee Supreme Court, it was the Unitarian Laymen's League, which is a version on the other side, a version of the Knights of Columbus for the Catholics. The Laymen's League put up a lot of money in order to keep Scopes out of jail, as well as to hire their own attorney to be as part of the defense. Eventually, the statute was overturned. Well, actually, the statute was affirmed, but the conviction stayed, and he was fined. He was fined $100, which may not sound like a lot now, but at the time it was a lot of money. And yet, the human origin story, the story of evolution, lingers. So I've put this up here. This is a very recent Gallup poll, and the purpose of this is to have you figure out where you fall. So this is Americans and what they believe about evolution. So I've been told I'm kind of colorblind, which accounts for the way I dress. But the green line, as you can see, ends up at 37%, and that is people who believe that God created humans in their present form. And then the blue line is the percentage of people who believe humans developed, but God guided their development. And then the dotted line is the percentage, which is a 24%. 24% of people believe that humans developed without God. So you can find your own place on there. But this is a poll that was just recently, and I was frankly surprised by the percentages. Be that as it may, that's where we stand today. After the trial and after all the appeals, which went eventually all the way up to the Supreme Court, conversations about the teaching of evolution in public schools died down until 1950. And then in February of 1950, we saw the meteoric rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy. So for those of you who know who Joseph McCarthy was, you may be scratching your head wondering, what is the relationship between the junior senator from Wisconsin in 1950 and the Scopes trial? Funny you should ask, because I'm going to tell you. In a speech in West Virginia, he claimed that the government was being infiltrated by communists and Marxists. Sound familiar? He expanded the claim to say that the American arts community was being infiltrated by communists and Marxists. And to prove his point, he began calling witnesses to come in and pinpointing how they were members of communist and Marxist organizations. And if they would admit it, then he wanted to know who they knew that was also part of those organizations. And as you may have read or you know, or perhaps you lived during that period, there were a lot of people who were implicated. There were people who were blacklisted, which means that once they were touched, once the finger was pointed at them, they could no longer find a job. It was a horrible period in our history. And there were people like Arthur Miller, the playwright, who was subject to this and who was blacklisted, and he decided to push back. And in 1953, he had written The Crucible. I don't know if it's still taught in the public schools. Both of my kids read The Crucible. Ironically, it's now part of the theater canon. So Arthur Miller got the last laugh. And as you may know, it's historically based on the Salem witch trials. And the prosecutor of those witch trials is simply a symbolic McCarthy. The play is an allegory. But The Crucible wasn't the only McCarthy allegory. In 1955, Jerome Lawrence and Robert Lee wrote To Inherit the Wind. And they took as their historical event the Scopes trial. That's how it's related. And the Scopes trial was an allegory about freedom of speech, freedom of association, all those things that the McCarthy hearings were pushing on and pushing on. And and interestingly enough, in 1955, when it premiered in Dallas, Texas, which I found interesting. It eventually made its way to Broadway, where it did not get a good review. But then in 1960, it was made into a movie with an all-star cast. It was loosely based on the Scopes trial. Williams, Lawrence, and Lee took a lot of liberties. They painted some pretty broad pictures of who people were and what they said, but I'm going to play a quick film clip from the movie that is actually taken from the transcript. And the only thing that's different about this clip is that it didn't take place in the courtroom, because it took place outside, because there were 3,000 people listening to Clarence Darrow. And Spencer Tracy plays Colonel Drummond, who's actually Clarence Darrow. So it's just a 1-minute clip, so you can listen and see what you think, get a flavor.
Is Mr. Drummond saying that this expression of an honest emotion will in any way influence the court's impartial administration of the law?
I say that you cannot administer a wicked law impartially. You can only destroy, you can only punish. And I warn you that a wicked law like cholera destroys everyone it touches, its upholders as well as its defiers.
Colonel Drummond.
Can't you understand that if you take a law like evolution and you make it a crime to teach it in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, and tomorrow you may make it a crime to read about it, and soon you may ban books and newspapers, and then you may turn Catholic against Protestant, and Protestant against Protestant, and try to foist your own religion upon the mind of man. If you can do one, you can do the other, because fanaticism and ignorance is forever busy and needs feeding. And soon, Your Honor, with banners flying and with drums beating, we'll be marching backward, through the glorious ages of that 16th century, when bigots burned the man who dared bring enlightenment and intelligence to the human mind.
It's worth a watch if you haven't seen it. It's, as I said, this is actually from the transcript of the trial. And it's pretty powerful given what's going on. And let me talk a little bit about what is going on. The play's stage direction set the time as not too long ago. Not too long ago. The play is timeless because the challenges are timeless. Individual freedom, scientific truth, Christian fundamentalism. Recently, the American Historical Association ran an editorial condemning the recent order from the Oklahoma State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ryan Walters, who has required all Oklahoma schools to incorporate the Bible, which includes the Ten Commandments, as an instructional support into the curriculum. This proclamation invokes the authority of the state government to assert that the Christian Bible had a substantial influence on the founding generation and the Constitution, as if this were a settled question among professional historians, legal scholars, and the judiciary. This is not true, and Oklahoma students deserve history education that is accurate and consistent with professional standards. My colleague, the Reverend Marlon Lavenhar, is the senior minister at our Tulsa Unitarian Universalist Church, our largest UU church, a church of 2,000 members. And they are only one of 3 Unitarian Universalist churches in Tulsa. And he turns out he's a cartoonist and regularly publishes in the Tulsa newspaper. So this was his cartoon, political commentary on the fact that Ryan Walters, even though he oversees a school system that is ranked 49th in the nation, is now implementing Christian icons, theology, dogma into the school system. And it's almost like, don't look at the fact that we're 49th in the nation. Look at me. Look at all these other things. Look at all these other things. In the first week of President Biden's term, he decommissioned the 1776 team. Former President Trump has promised to recommission them and their report. In the last several years, over 25 states have limited what teachers can say in their classrooms when it comes to history. There have been bans on books and curriculum, and many teachers have had to sign loyalty oaths at the price of losing their jobs if they didn't obey. So the big question is, what drives this movement? It's the same tired rhetoric. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing identity. The fear of loss. Fear draws the circle tighter. Fear narrows thinking. Fear shuts people out. If I could have the last slide, Alec. As Unitarian Universalists, we aspire to claim and nurture just the opposite. Look at our shared values: faith, gratitude, acceptance, justice, sharing, growth, creativity, appreciation, anti-racism, community. If you don't notice, that's the chalice. That's a nice way of presenting our chalice. But all of those lead to what is our center, which is love. Love does not fear. Love welcomes. Love seeks the truth. Love demands justice. There is nothing easy about having love at the center of your faith. This is what I don't understand when people say, oh, Unitarian Universalism, it's such an easy religion. There's nothing easy about putting love at the center. In many respects, putting fear at the center is the easiest way to go. Love at the center is so much harder than fear. But this is our way. You could say it's our origin story. So please, let us live into this promise. Amen.